Okay, hi everybody. We're going to get started. My name's Neil Safir. I'm the current director of the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. I say current director because I'm about to introduce the previous director who's going to introduce our speaker today. But I just wanted to say first and foremost how excited we are to have Dr. Fletcher with us today, given the fact that the theme and topic of what he's going to be discussing with us today relates to many things that we are concerned about in CLACS specifically, and I think in the Watson more generally. The climate, the scale of analysis that we utilize to think about complex issues. In this case, we're going to be talking about small island developing states. So understanding that depending on the size of the unit, there are particular kinds of issues and challenges that we face, and also the question of geography. Has always been something that we are interested in thinking about in terms of Latin America and the Caribbean, the connections and distinctions between that. And then finally, question of justice and the social dimensions of how it is that we look at and think about and address these kinds of questions. So just to say that this talk really ticks a lot of boxes of the kinds of things and complex questions that we're interested in examining. And with that, I turn things over to Patsy Lewis, who is a long-time colleague and friend of Dr. Fletcher, and who's going to introduce him to us. Patsy.
Thank you, Neil. Good afternoon, everyone. A special welcome to my class. I hope all 20 of you are here. Hi. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Fletcher. We were talking about how long we've known each other. We first met as PhD students at Cambridge University, and over 30 years ago, I was wondering if I could just fib a little and say maybe 20, but no, it's 20 plus, well over 30 years ago. And it's really my pleasure to have him here, and thanks to CLACS and, Neil Safir and Maria and Elisa for facilitating his visit here this year. James Fletcher was a minister of the Public Service, Information, Broadcasting, Sustainable Development, Energy, Science, and Technology in St. Lucia from 2011 to 2016. Under his leadership, the Caribbean's 1.5 to Stay Alive climate change civil society campaign was developed. In addition to leading the Caribbean's delegation to COP21 negotiations on the Paris Agreement, he was also a member of a small group of ministers chosen by the COP president to help achieve consensus on the various elements of the Paris Agreement. In recognition of his work at COP21, James Fletcher was highlighted in Profiles of Paris as one of the people who played an important role in creating the Paris Agreement. During his tenure as a minister, James Fletcher led an aggressive modernization of the energy sector with new investments in renewable energy, the establishment of a new multi-sector utility regulator, and the enactment of new energy legislation. He commissioned modern information technology centers in several underserved communities around St. Lucia and started a program for free island-wide Wi-Fi. Dr. Fletcher initiated major water redevelopment projects in the south and east coasts and the desilting of the island's major reservoir. He developed a 311 call center to provide the public with quicker and easier access to the public service, and established an employee assistance program to provide free confidential counseling for public officers. Dr. Fletcher is the author of the book Governing in a Small Caribbean Island State. He authored the chapter, The Fight for Small Island Developing States, in the Cambridge University Press publication, Negotiating the Paris Agreement, The Insider Stories. And he edited and produced Where is the Justice? An anthology of Caribbean youth perspectives on the climate crisis. He also wrote the Regional Strategic Action Plan for Governance and Building Climate Resilience in the Water Sector in the Caribbean. In 2019, Dr. Fletcher was selected by the United Kingdom's Chevening Scholarship Program as one of 35 global change makers. He currently manages his own consulting firm, Soloricon. Okay. In 2020, he launched a Caribbean Climate Justice Project, which is an initiative aimed at increasing civil society awareness of the impacts of climate change and ensuring that there are appropriate responses at the national, regional, and international levels to issues of climate justice and just transitions. Dr. Fletcher is currently the chairman of the executive board of the Caribbean Center for Renewable Energy and Energy Efficiency. He holds a BSc in biochemistry with honors from the University of Ottawa and a PhD in crop physiology from the University of Cambridge. I can think of no better suited person to talk about the challenges that small island developing states face from climate change than Dr. Fletcher. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patsy, and thank you, Neil, for the invitation. I would have preferred if the temperature was warmer, but you can't always have everything, but it's good to be here in Providence. I was telling both Neil and Patsy that it was a bit of a rocky start because we had a little bit of an issue. You had very strong crosswinds last night, and we almost didn't land. We almost had to go across to Boston. But I think everybody wanted me to be here, so that didn't happen. So it's good to be talking to you about the climate crisis in small island developing states. I'm hoping that after the presentation that I would have stimulated enough thought and in some instances outrage in you, that you will flood me with questions, some of which I hope I can answer, some of which I hope I can tell you how to direct the outrage. But yeah, so let's delve into it. How many of you have heard of the Paris Agreement? Hopefully everybody in this room. Quick show of hands? Yeah, okay. So the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015 at Le Bourget in Paris, where 195, 196 countries came together to discuss a new climate pact for the planet. There were a lot of discussions and there was quite a bit of diplomacy that preceded it. And we went into Paris with a bit of trepidation about whether we would get an ambitious agreement. But fortunately, we came out of Paris with an ambitious agreement. And these were actually my words to the closing plenary at the Paris Agreement.
The government of St. Lucia and the governments of the countries that make up CARICOM applaud the process that has culminated in the production of the Paris Agreement that we have just adopted. This has been a resounding triumph of multilateralism. You employed an inclusive, transparent, party-driven mechanism that allowed every country, regardless of physical size or economic circumstance, to have its voice heard. Mr. President, I can confidently speak on behalf of my fellow Caribbean delegations when I say that perhaps for the first time in a long time, Caribbean and other states truly felt that our concerns were being heard at a COP.
So this is how we felt coming out of Paris, that, you know, very often those negotiations are dominated by the large countries. They're the ones, although they have just the same vote as the smaller countries, but they exert an undue amount of influence, and they are able to guide the direction in which the negotiations go. We felt coming out of Paris that we really had a very open, transparent, party-driven process, that everybody was equal. So there were no firsts among equals. You know, you had a group of countries all committed to varying degrees to doing what was right. And basically, this is the Eiffel Tower when the Paris Agreement was adopted, 1.5 degrees, which was something that absolutely nobody expected us to come out, except small island developing states, expected that would have been one of the outcomes of the Paris Agreement. Because going into Paris, the threshold was 2 degrees Celsius. And even that, some countries were very reluctant to admit that 2 degrees Celsius was the threshold. We said for small island developing states like ours, that threshold had to be lowered because 2 degrees Celsius would unleash a a cataclysm of disastrous impacts that we would not be able to tolerate. And 1.5 degrees Celsius was the absolute maximum. Now, that's not to say that we're safe at 1.5 degrees Celsius, but that anything above 1.5 degrees Celsius is a major problem. So this is actually the Washington Post at the beginning of the talks for the Paris Agreement. And this was written by Chris Mooney, who covers climate and environmental issues for the Washington Post. And he was basically referring to the small island developing states, saying that these countries are the moral center of the climate debate. Will they be left behind? So basically identifying that small island developing states are really the ones that are at the front line of this existential battle with the climate crisis. Will their voices finally be heard? And there were some things that aligned going into Paris. So there was momentum for an ambitious agreement. And you had countries that ordinarily would have been adversaries, would have not been on the same page, coming together and saying, okay, you know what? We can't have a repeat of Copenhagen, which we had, I think, in 2009. We can't have that disaster. We really must have an ambitious Paris Agreement to ensure that we can save this planet from what we see coming up ahead. Young people like you were really the wind beneath our sails. So our Caribbean young people were engaged. They supported us all the way. They were a big part of this 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign. And they made it clear to us that we could not leave Paris without an ambitious climate agreement, that their future, much more than my future, their future was what was at stake, that the planet that we were creating and the planet that we would be handing over to them, to you, would be much worse than the planet that was handed over to us by my parents. And that could not be our legacy. Our legacy could not be that in this relay we were dropping the baton or giving a baton that was poisoned or not as good as the one that was handed over to us. And our young people were really a very crucial part of our advocacy and the determination with which we went to Paris. But there were other things that lined up. Our artists supported our work. This is Aaron Silk from Jamaica, the brother of Garnet Silk. Some of you may or may not know, depending on where your musical tastes lie, and Menendez from Belize. And we brought them to Paris, and the Caribbean booth at Le Bourget was the booth with the most vibes. You know, there was always music happening, people always coming around to see what we were doing and to listen to the music. So there was a whole vibe around the Caribbean, about the Caribbean and small island developing states, which helped because, you know, it can't always be boring technical stuff about gigatons of greenhouse gases. If you want to cause people to rally to your cause, you have to balance the technical, the stuff that makes your eyes glaze, with what they can relate to. And our artists really helped us do that. Civil society was mobilized and supported our cause. So this was actually a sit-in by Greenpeace in the main negotiating hall, and it was really heartening to see everybody there talking about 1.5 to stay alive, 1.5, we need climate finance, loss and damage, all of the things that resonated with us. Civil society was saying that and saying that repeatedly at the conference venue, but also outside of the conference venue. We use the international media to tell our story to the world. So almost every day I had to be giving interviews to BBC, Associated Press, everyone, to try to get them to understand what was at stake and to carry our point of view in the media releases that went out. And that was very critically important. And then, interestingly, towards the middle, because the Conference of the Parties, the negotiations that form the discussions every year on climate change are 2 weeks long. So the first week is the week when the technical negotiators get together. And the second week is when the ministers and ambassadors come in and they now start trying to hone in on the elements of text that, you know, the wording, the wordsmithing that takes place, whether it should be shall or should, which is actually an interesting story. The whole Paris Agreement almost unraveled over shall and should. The United States raised strong objection to the use of the word shall, and it had to be changed to should, because should does not have the same legal obligation that shall has. And everything almost unraveled at the very last minute because of that. So there's a lot of very technical wordsmithing and sometimes very frustrating splitting of hairs that takes place in these negotiations. But towards the end of the first week, this is Chris Mooney again writing, the radical idea that's gaining momentum at the Paris climate talks, because apparently, to those on the outside, 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal was gaining traction. And this was something that they did not expect, because everybody came there expecting, okay, 2 degrees Celsius, but the word was starting to filter that maybe we might actually get 1.5 degrees Celsius as the long-term temperature goal. And a little bit later in my talk, I'll tell you why that's so important. But there were many things, as I said, a lot of ducks lined up. There were many things that helped. So President Obama, who was in the chair at the time, strode very strong leadership. And the United States was very influential in what took place. Obama had gone and met with Xi Jinping in China. He had met with Modi in India. And he had embarked on his own level, his own tour of climate diplomacy, trying to rally support for an ambitious agreement. And with the United States in your corner, although I said we're all equal, but having the United States pushing for a strong climate change agreement always helps. The French, this is Laurent Fabius, who was the president of the COP, foreign minister of France. The French were also very decisive, very focused. And again, they also embarked on their own levels of diplomacy. So they did not leave everything to the last minute in Paris. They had a lot of pre-COP ministerials where they tried to gauge the temperature of the room, see where the fault lines lay, who was very warm on an ambitious agreement, who was a little cool, and how they could use influence to try to bring the sides together. And I think it's no coincidence that you've had so many very important global agreements to end wars have been signed in Paris. The French are really good at diplomacy, and we saw that during Paris. There's a rumor, for example, that towards the end, on the very last day, or the penultimate day, Nicaragua was holding back. And Nicaragua, there was something in the agreement that Nicaragua did not agree with, and a call had to be made to the Pope, so the Pope could call the president of Nicaragua and try to get them to and those are some of the negotiations that take place. I mean, I have an interesting story that I don't really have time to tell here about the Australians and some of the things that we had to do to get the Australians on board when they appeared to renege on an agreement that they'd made with us. So I kind of had to call the Sydney Morning Herald and do an interview with the Sydney Morning Herald to tell them what the Australians and St. Lucia had agreed to. So that kind of backed Australia into a corner when it showed up on the front page of one of their important dailies, and they then had to say, yes, yeah, we have agreed to support 1.5. So negotiations are not always finalized in the plenary hall. Very often, as you've heard, I'm sure, countless times, it's what happens in the corridors. It's what happens over coffee. That's where you get parties coming together. But the French were very decisive. Ban Ki-moon at the time, who was Secretary General, was very sympathetic to the concerns of small island developing states, and that definitely helped. Pope Francis had put out this Laudato Si, which was really his encyclical on the kind of world we should be living in. And even if you're not Catholic, but the Pope does have a very powerful influence in some countries in Europe, certainly in Latin America, and him joining this fight as an advocate for climate justice really did help us generate that momentum. Our negotiators, although they're small island developing state negotiators, we can't afford to have large numbers of people flying all over the world going to COP. So our negotiators are always much smaller than everybody else's, even when you pool all of our negotiators together. But as usual, they punch above their weight. I mean, there are some people in there who are absolutely incredible. They don't sleep during the COP, so they do 48-hour shifts. They catch a nap on a sofa somewhere, on a chair somewhere, or even standing up. Whilst the large countries can cycle their negotiators, our negotiators are there, and they always really do yeoman work for small island developing states. So at the end, this was the headline: how a 1.5 degree target overcame the odds at COP21. This really took everyone by surprise. Nobody thought that the Paris Agreement would have had reference to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So we left Paris, those of us who were there, left Paris hopeful that we had an international agreement and a global commitment to fight climate change. We said, yes, finally we have the instrument that will allow us to take the battle to the people who are causing the climate crisis, but also an acknowledgement from the large countries that we will do something about this.
After 2 intense weeks in this beautiful city of Paris, of which unfortunately I've seen very little, I can return home to the citizens of my country and the Caribbean and reassure them that the world cares about them. I can tell the young people in our region who adopted 1.5 to stay alive as their mantra that their future looks much brighter today. Their future looks much brighter today than it did 2 weeks ago. I can say to the artists who have sung songs and written poetic verse on the need for urgent action on climate change that their voices have been heard. On a personal level, when I return to my home in St. Lucia, I can look back fondly and proudly on my 2 weeks here in Paris and know that together with a group of hardworking and determined men and women, I helped create history, a history that will ensure that my island and our planet will have a more certain future. My country, St. Lucia, is very proud and pleased to associate itself with this historic Paris Agreement. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for giving me this privilege. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, James, et merci pour le bon travail que tu as fait. Et si tu dois rentrer vite à Sainte-Lucie, reviens à Paris rapidement.
So this is how we left Paris. This is how we left Paris on December the 13th, or might have been the 12th, 2015, optimistic that, yes, we have a Paris Agreement and we will be able to fight climate change. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you that that feeling of elation has persisted, that we felt that there has been the type of fidelity to that Paris Agreement that we were expecting, and that people have genuinely done what they promised that they would do. In fact, if you were to ask many people who work in that space, they will tell you that that space has been littered with many broken promises. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that puts out these reports periodically has shown us that greenhouse gas levels are the highest that we have ever seen, and that's going back 800,000 years. That's how high greenhouse gas emissions are. And that human influence has warmed the climate at a rate that is unprecedented in at least the last 2,000 years. So that's the timeline we're dealing with. We're not really dealing with the last century, the last 200 years. We're talking about unprecedented warming, unprecedented emissions of greenhouse gases. We're seeing that this was last year, ocean surface hits the highest ever recorded temperature, and it's set to go even further. That land and sea surface temperatures are hotter than ever before. And these are all headlines from last year, 2023. The temperatures in Greenland haven't been this warm in at least 1,000 years. And that Greenland's ice was melting at the rate scientists thought would be our worst case scenario in 2070. So it means that we're almost 50 years ahead of schedule for what our worst case scenario, warming. And the scary thing is that at the two poles, the North Pole and the South Pole, the warming is taking place much faster and at a higher pace than it is for the rest of the planet. So the two places that are most fragile and where melting ice would have the biggest impact on low-lying countries and small island developing states, that's where we're seeing some of the warmest temperatures and the quickest increases. The impact of rising sea levels is being underestimated, scientists warn. And again, that's something that many of us, particularly those of us who are trained scientists, have always said, because our planet is not a static system. It's a living organism. And if you have, take your body, for example, if you have a persistent temperature, a persistent fever, persistent high temperature, persistent fever, at some point, other organs in your body are going to start being affected. So your liver, your kidney, your heart, your lungs will start being affected because of that fever. And it's the same thing with our planet. As the temperatures increase and remain persistently high, then there are feedback mechanisms that cause a lot of our ecosystems to now become very fragile, that as you start melting away the white ice at the poles, then you start exposing the darker permafrost, then that absorbs sunlight much better than the white snow, which was reflecting the sunlight. So the warming increases, and then you get acceleration of warming. So all of these things are causing a cascading effect, which are working to our detriment. And that's why I believe we've been underestimating the level of sea level rise that's taking place. Our oceans are getting more acidic, and there's a very simple reason for this. As we produce more carbon dioxide, the carbon dioxide is absorbed by our oceans. We always think of our forests, our trees, as the #1 sink for carbon dioxide, because we've all learned in biology that carbon dioxide is converted by plants into starch for a process called photosynthesis. But our oceans also absorb carbon dioxide. And the more carbon dioxide they absorb, and we're in a university, so I can do a small course of Chemistry 101, carbon dioxide mixing with H2O causes carbonic acid to be formed, more hydrogen ions. So your oceans become more acidic. And as your oceans become more acidic, that has very detrimental impacts on marine life. So we're finding that in the Pacific, Dungeness crabs are having difficulty forming shells because as the ocean waters become more acidic, it's more difficult for shellfish to form shells. Now, if you're like me, I'm pescatarian, I don't eat meat, I only eat fish, then my food security is now being threatened because it means that my major source of protein is diminishing. But even quite apart from that, I mean, in all of these countries, particularly in the small island developing states, their fishery is a major source of economic activity. So if that fishery is now being impacted because of ocean acidification, then that's a problem. Now, when I've given this talk in the past, I've said to my audience that when you have an ocean that is acidic, you cannot do like you do if you have acid reflux or you have a slightly acidic stomach. What do? You take Tums or something else to neutralize the acid in your stomach. You cannot do that with the ocean. That's what I used to say up until day before yesterday. I'll tell you why that has changed in a while, but it's still very ominous. So yes, so our oceans are becoming more acidic. Morocco, and the next few slides will just really go, there are a litany of the climate hotspots and the records that we're seeing being broken all over the world. So Morocco hit a temperature of 50 degrees Celsius for the first time. I want you to try to imagine what 50 degrees Celsius feels like. 50 degrees Celsius. That is scary hot. That is the kind of heat that you cannot survive in, that you cannot function in. You know, that Morocco saw that last year. Canadian wildfires, and I'm not sure whether here, but I know in New York you had the impact, you had it here also, of the Canadian wildfires and how that impacted your lives. So imagine that, and right now I think there's some serious wildfires going on in Texas, some of the worst that they've seen in a very long time. That many of those are as a consequence of climate change because you have drier conditions, hotter conditions, which make it really ripe for wildfires to take place. We saw what happened in Hawaii, the Maui wildfires that devastated that area, again, as a result of heat. Freddie was a cyclone that lasted for a month in Mozambique, Malawi, and Madagascar. Can you imagine a cyclone sticking around for a month? In the Bahamas, Hurricane Dorian, when it hit the Bahamas a few years ago, hovered around that country for 3 or 4 days. That's what we're seeing now because these conditions are almost the perfect soup for these hurricanes to form and to strengthen and to exist in. China, heaviest rains in 140 years, killing at least 27 missing. Phoenix, a heat wave that lasted an entire month, a 30-day heat wave. Greece faced its longest heat wave on record. All of that was last year. Wildfires in the EU devastated an area that was 41% of its natural space. And Otis was the one that, for me, was as bad as all of these are, Otis was the one that was really frightening. Otis hit Acapulco last year. Now, those of you, fortunately, you live in a part of the world where hurricanes are not a regular part of your life. But in the Caribbean, we pay very close attention to whether it's a tropical storm or Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, Category 4, Category 5. Because the higher you go, the more intense the hurricane is, the stronger the winds. So when you hear that you're going to be hit by a tropical storm, you're anxious, but you're not that anxious. You're not besieged with trepidation because you figure, okay, a tropical storm, those are winds that are not 75 miles an hour, we can handle that. Otis went from a tropical storm to a Category 5 hurricane in 12 hours. So Acapulco, Mexico was preparing for a tropical storm and was hit by a Cat 5 hurricane. Now, there's no way you could change your preparations in 12 hours to ramp up your preparations from dealing with a tropical storm to dealing with a storm that has winds of over 150, 160 miles an hour. That's what we're seeing now. Because our oceans are so warm, these hurricanes are intensifying so quickly. So climate change is not causing more frequent hurricanes. What it's causing is stronger hurricanes, and that's what we have to deal with. We now have heat waves in South America. Brazil, in the middle of its winter. So our summer is Brazil's winter. It's winter in the southern hemisphere. Brazil saw one of the hottest winters ever at the same time we were having our hottest summer. And the same thing with Chile. So all across the globe. So what I'm trying to get across to you is that this is not isolated spots. This is not just islands in the Caribbean or the Pacific. No country is being spared. So let's look at what happened last year. So NASA found that June 2023 was the hottest June on record. So that's the hottest June we've ever had. We had it last year. Then July came around, and July said, hold my shirt. July then became not just the hottest July ever, but the hottest month ever. We had never seen a month as hot as July 2023. And then August came around, and August said, well, I want to be on the action. So August then became the hottest August ever. I'm sure you see where I'm going with this, right? September was then the hottest September ever in over 174 years. October then became the hottest October ever. November then became the hottest November ever. And December was the hottest December ever. So from June to December, every single one of those months broke the record for the month, and July broke the record for all months. And just to, so 2023 was the hottest year ever by a large amount, broke all records, and this kind of gives you an indication of how the graph has been going, and this is a close-up of it. So this is 2023. You could see just how hot 2023 was compared to all the previous years. The previous hottest year before 2023, before last year, was 2016, followed very closely by 2020. 2023 blew all of that out of the water. Okay? Now, just in case you believe that that was an anomaly, 2023 is behind us, thank God, we can move on. January of this year has been the hottest January ever. February of this year has started breaking all sorts of records again, and February is the hottest month, hottest February ever. So going back to June to February, every single month has broken the record for that month. And this year we've seen that monitoring stations all across the world, South Africa, Saudi Arabia, Thailand, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, Colombia, North Korea, the Maldives, Belize, have all registered monthly heat records. And in the first half of February, 140 countries broke monthly records. And headlines from all over, you'll see Thailand, South Africa, Western Australia, you name it. We're seeing heat records being broken. And a lot of that is due to climate change, but some of it is also due to the strong El Nino that we're experiencing. But the combination of El Nino and climate change is baffling scientists because they did not expect to see temperatures this high. Now, what does that mean for where we are? Because remember, we went to Paris, and we said that we would limit the temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Well, the most optimistic warming scenario we have currently has us at 1.8 degrees Celsius by the end of this year. That's the most optimistic. If we do above and beyond everything that we say that we will do, we probably will settle, if we're lucky, around 1.8 degrees Celsius. If we look on the basis of the pledges and the targets that the various countries have committed to, we will settle somewhere around 2.1 degrees Celsius. If we have to go on just the targets, so forget their pledges, but let's look at what they've set in record as their targets for 2030, we will be somewhere around 2.4 degrees Celsius. But if we go on the basis of what they're doing, so forget what they've pledged, what they've said, just on the basis of what they're doing, we will settle somewhere between 2.7 and 3.6 degrees Celsius by the end of this century. So that's where we are. That's the promise that has been broken so far, that Paris Agreement in 2015, 9 years later, we're actually on track for a 2.5 degrees Celsius warmer world by the end of this century. Now, remember I said to you about terms and taking in terms? This is something I saw just yesterday when I thought that I was closing out this lecture and saying, okay, shut down, I won't do any more work on this. Then I see this. Scientists resort to once unthinkable solutions to cool the planet. So one of the things they're thinking of, and in Israel, there's a startup that has done this. They are testing a system to send a plane very high up into our atmosphere and disperse a cloud of tiny reflective particles about 60,000 feet in altitude to reflect sunlight away from the Earth to cool the atmosphere in a concept known as solar radiation management. So I don't know whether you know this, but anytime there's a volcanic eruption, a major volcanic eruption, that has a cooling effect on the planet because that cloud of volcanic ash, it actually causes the sunlight to be reflected back up. So this is based on that principle. So what they want to do is to send aircraft up into the high atmosphere and just flood it with these particles that will reflect. But there is something, and that last sentence would be, for me, and I hope for you, the cause of concern. They would not disclose the composition of the proprietary particles. So whatever they're going to drop up there is proprietary. They won't tell you what it is. But if you're going to drop something up there, then I need to know whether that's going to affect me, whether it's going to come back down to Earth and what it's going to do, whether it's going to affect the ozone layer. So this is one of the engineered solutions they're looking at. Another solution that they're looking at, and they're looking at this in Australia, is they wanted to basically send a spray of a briny mixture of a high pressure mixture into the atmosphere, hoping that that will cause the clouds to get brighter and larger. And again, that will have a cooling effect on our atmosphere. So, it's almost like we're running out of ideas. We don't know what to do. So let's just try anything now. When the thing that really will work is reducing on emissions of greenhouse gases. That's the thing that will cause the planet to not warm as quickly as it is. Nobody wants to take that bull by the horn. So everybody's looking for other things. And this is my thumb solution. In Massachusetts, not too far away from here, researchers at Woodhull Oceanographic Institute have decided to pour 6,000 gallons of a liquid solution of sodium hydroxide, which basically is Tums, which basically is Diavol or Malox or all these other things that we put into our system when we have an acid stomach, to see whether that now is going to combine with the carbon dioxide and form a bicarbonate that's going to sit on the ocean floor to reduce the ocean acidification. So I can no longer say in my talks that we can't take our ocean is not like our stomach. We can't just take a whole set of Tums, because that apparently is what they want to do. They want to put some large Tums into the ocean to see whether that's going to cause a negation. Even the White House has weighed in on this and said that while the technologies offer the possibility of cooling the planet, they also carry unknown risks, such as depleting the protective ozone layer, harming marine life, damaging crops, or altering rainfall patterns. But that's the level of desperation that our scientists have found themselves in. Now, for all small island developing states, this climate crisis will have devastating consequences. And this is a very beautiful village on the east coast of my country called Dennery, which, as you can see, just picture this. Sea level rise, what that will do. The coast for all small island developing states is our jugular. It's really where the most important arteries and veins run. It's where all of our economic infrastructure is located. It's where most of our social infrastructure, including that church that you see there, that's right on the waterfront. So anything that approaches a 1 meter or 2 meter sea level rise will cause devastating consequences. Now, my country is mountainous, so there is some inland retreat that can take place. But think of a country like Kiribati, or the Marshall Islands, or the Bahamas, or the Cayman Islands, where they're flat. Barbados, a 1.5 or 2 meter sea level rise will cause devastation of the entire country. That's why Fiji is looking at, can we buy land in another country to relocate our people? Because we will be climate refugees. If things continue at this rate, there will be nowhere left for us to go. The impacts are diverse and grave. Climate change will impact everything for small island developing states, low-lying countries, but everywhere else. Sea level rise, more frequent flooding, longer droughts. We're already seeing that in my country and throughout the Caribbean. Stronger storms, water insecurity. We used to have a drought once every 5, 10, 15 years. We have a drought in the Caribbean every year. Food insecurity. As your availability of water diminishes, as your temperatures become hotter, and as your sea levels rise and your soils become more saline because the salt water is creeping in, then your soils become less productive. And also adverse health impacts, because you have vectors that are now migrating because conditions are becoming more favorable for them. So the impacts of climate change, there isn't a sector that is not impacted by climate change, not one you could think of. So our countries in the Caribbean are in a continuous cycle of repair and recovery. No sooner have we dealt with one event than we have to deal with another. And it's not just a storm or a hurricane, it's flooding, it's crop failure, it's everything. And just look at the impact that hurricanes have had on the Caribbean. And you could see how even sometimes when we are referred to as being middle-income countries or high middle-income countries, a hurricane can pass and over the space of 24 hours reduce a high middle-income country or a high-income country to nothing. So, for example, when Hurricane Gilbert, of which many reggae songs were made in Jamaica, passed through Jamaica, it caused damage equivalent to 365% of that country's GDP. So it means that over 3 times the entire productive output of that country over the course of a year was wiped out in less than 24 hours. Same thing with Grenada. When Hurricane Ivan passed, 203% of its GDP was obliterated in 24 hours. Dominica had to deal with Tropical Storm Erica in 2015, caused damage of 90% of its GDP. And 2 years later, Hurricane Maria, and 226. And that's where, I said to you that when the tropical storm is passing, we feel a little good that it's not going to be too bad. Well, Tropical Storm Maria caused damage that was almost equivalent to all of Dominica's GDP in 24 hours. And we've seen the same thing in St. Lucia with Tropical Storm Debbie, I think, in 1994. So not even with a tropical storm are you spared. And this just gives you some indication of what, at the varying temperature levels, how the impacts increase, how the cost of those impacts and the cost of responding to those impacts increase. I will leave a copy of this slide, so don't make frantic notes. You don't have to copy everything or take pictures. Patsy will have a copy so she can distribute to all of you. A copy of the presentation, sorry, not the slide. So, and this is Professor Michael Taylor of the University of the West Indies Mona campus, and his team has done some extensive work on all the impacts of 2.5 degrees Celsius warming, which is where we seem to be heading, what that will have on the Caribbean. And we talked about over 200 days excessively warm. So that's what, 2/3 of the, more than half of the year in the Caribbean being excessively warm. Reduction of precipitation between 15 and 25% over the course. That's scary, particularly for countries that depend on rainfall for agriculture. And when 230 medical journals come together in the height of the COVID crisis and declare the climate crisis as the greatest threat to global public health, it tells you how serious it is. So we're in the middle of the climate crisis. First of all, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the way scientists work, but to get 230 medical journals to agree on any one thing is amazing. Scientists like to disagree because everybody's looking at things from their different viewpoints. I can afford to say that because my background is science, so I don't think I'll offend too many scientists with this. But 230 medical journals got together in the middle of COVID and declared the climate crisis as the greatest threat to global public health. So really, the cost of adapting to the effects of the climate crisis and addressing loss and damage continue to spiral beyond the capacity of small island developing states. In 2009, in Copenhagen, developed countries pledged $100 billion annually to fight climate change. That money would be going to developing countries from 2020. So that was a pledge made in 2009. Have we received this? No. We're nowhere anywhere near that. That's what the climate finance that has been mobilized between 2013 and 2020 looks like. And even that picture is not an accurate one, as I'll show you in a while. Most of the money that has gone to climate change has been in the form of loans. So can you imagine? My easiest analogy is that someone passes and they take a baseball bat and they break both of your legs at the kneecap, break your legs. And then they say to you, well, the crutches that you will need for your recovery, I can lend them to you, but you have to pay me for them. So you now have to go to the bank, and the surgery you'll have to pay for. I'll give you a loan for the surgery, and I'll also give you a loan for the crutches and the cast that you will use in your recovery. That's really what is happening, because the countries that have caused the climate crisis are saying to the countries that are the victims of the climate crisis, well, we can give you the money to adapt to it, but you have to lend it from us. You have to borrow it from us, sorry. We will lend it to you. We're not going to give it to you in the form of grants. And we've been saying that, no, you caused the crisis. It is unconscionable for you to now tell us that we have to borrow that money from you at market rates. But that's what's going on. So when you hear talk about climate finance, a lot of that finance is in the form of loans. So the countries that caused the crisis are still benefiting from the crisis by getting the interest from the loans that they're disbursing to the countries that are the victims of the crisis. And then a lot of the money is being given for mitigation. But in the Caribbean's case, mitigation, which means reducing emissions of greenhouse gases, is not important because we are not major emitters of greenhouse gases. Adaptation is what's more important to us. We need money to adapt to the impacts of climate change. When most of the money is going towards mitigation, that's only helping the countries that are major greenhouse gas emitters. That is the industrialized countries. And then even Oxfam has found that many of the rich countries are being dishonest and misleading in how they are accounting for their climate finance. So they're blending money that they're already giving in other areas, a lot of their overseas finance, and they're calling it climate finance to the point where they may be overestimating by as much as 225% the climate finance that they claim to be giving out. And for small island developing states, the 388 projects that have been disbursed to them over 40 states is roughly totaling $2.1 billion. That's a drop in the bucket for reasons you'll see now. The adaptation costs in developing countries, so the cost to developing countries of adapting to climate change are currently in the range of $160 to $340 billion a year. And that will increase to between $365 to $500 billion in 2050. So the money that's being given is nowhere near the needs of those countries. And then when you add loss and damage refers to those impacts of climate change that are irreversible. So for example, if you have sea level rise and you lose major parts of your coastline, so where you used to go to the beach and bathe, that area is now underwater, you can't adapt to that. If you have ocean acidification that has caused your oceans to become so acidic that your fisheries catch is no longer there, that your colorful coral reefs that tourists visit the Caribbean so they can go diving in the hope that they'll find Nemo, that's not there. These reefs are now dead. How do you adapt to that? You can't adapt to that. And that's where loss and damage comes in, because loss and damage refers to the extreme weather events like hurricanes, but also the slow onset impacts like sea level rise and ocean acidification to which you cannot adapt. Those costs are already in the range of $400 billion annually. So that's in addition to the adaptation money. So you could see that the ask for small island developing states and developing countries is currently somewhere in the vicinity of $600 to $700 billion annually. $700 billion. Remember the pledge was for $100 billion a year. Right now, that ask is somewhere in the vicinity of $700 billion. And we're not even at the $100 billion mark. And the longer you delay to give that money is the more those needs spiral out of control. At COP28, a lot of talk was made and people were happy that we finally had a loss and damage fund for vulnerable countries. This is something we've been fighting for decades. We finally got it last year in Dubai. And even more beating of chests and elation over the fact that $700 billion was pledged by some of the major countries that were there. The $700 million as an immediate put into this. That $700 million is less than 0.2% of what the countries need on an annual basis. Yeah? So yes, $700 million sounds like a lot, but when you have a country that its entire economy is being devastated by a hurricane, its water courses are drying up, it's becoming so hot that the farmers can't go out to work, construction workers are at risk, the sea level rise is damaging major economic infrastructure, that's no money. Meanwhile, in the G20, what's happening? Well, global greenhouse gases, global carbon emissions from fossil fuels reached their highest level in 2023. So where we should be peaking and going down, we're still increasing. The world's carbon emitters, we know who they are. They're continuing to emit. So the United States, European Union countries, Japan, China, they are still the major emitters. The big oil companies are the ones that are causing the problem. None of these companies reside in small island developing states. They all reside in G20 countries. And just for comparison, to show you how much of a victim the Caribbean is, these are the emissions of Caribbean countries to the global inventory of greenhouse gases on a yearly basis. So Trinidad and Tobago, which is an oil producer, an oil and gas producer in the Caribbean, it produces less than 0.2% of global greenhouse gases. So the entire Caribbean as a whole produces less than 0.2% of greenhouse gases. But who is at the front line of the battle? We are. And the fossil fuel companies, since the beginning of the Ukraine war, have profited to the tune of over $250 billion. And that the big five fossil fuel companies paid their shareholders last year alone $111 billion in dividends. $111 billion in dividends, yet we are rejoicing over $700 million that was given as pledges to small island developing states. And the IMF, fossil fuels are being subsidized at a rate of $13 million a minute. I mean, not even Messi and Mbappe and LeBron James and these guys with the massive salaries that they make can come anywhere near to that kind of salary. Subsidies surged to a record $7 trillion last year, and that the G20 has poured in more than $1 trillion into fossil fuel subsidies despite their pledges. So going back to the broken promises. But there's also another sinister thing that's happening. The Conference of the Parties, the COPs, where all the negotiators come together to discuss climate change, they've now been infiltrated by fossil fuel lobbyists. So last year in Dubai, at the COP, there were 2,465 fossil fuel lobbyists. Now, why would fossil fuel lobbyists attend or be allowed to attend climate change negotiations? That's equivalent to having arms dealers, so the people who produce the major supplies of arms, come to peace talks. That's what we're doing. So there must be broken promises because the whole system is rigged. It's not fair. And I'm saying this as a negotiator. I still have confidence in our negotiating process and in our negotiators, but I'm sorry it is not delivering what we expect as quickly as we need it to, and that's where the problem lies. And there's diminishing confidence in the ability of the COPs to deliver the urgent transformational changes that are needed. And the last 4 COPs, every time there has been quite a bit of anguish over what the agreement, what the final text has said. Yes, we've made progress, but it is slow, incremental progress. So time is running out. What can we do? Well, first of all, we're approaching a tipping point. I think that's very clear. How can we and how should we respond? We have to sharpen the focus on climate justice. This is now a justice issue. This is a human rights issue. This is an issue where people who are being victimized twice. They're the ones who are being impacted, and nothing is happening. We just keep being strung along. So we have to sharpen the focus on climate justice. In fact, 2 years ago, at the Commonwealth People's Forum in Kigali, in Rwanda, I was part of a group of advocates who asked for the establishment of a World Environmental Court to deal with climate justice. We can't have these decisions being discussed in the International Criminal Court. Although that's the only place for it, I think the urgency of these issues and how quickly they must be responded to calls for a new judicial apparatus to deal with them. In 2022, I think it was, the UN declared a healthy environment a human right. So if the UN has declared a healthy environment to be a human right, and you have countries and companies that are imperiling your chances of experiencing or living in a healthy environment, then they clearly are violating your human rights. And that is why we're saying that this is a climate justice issue. And the International Court of Justice has been asked to advise states on climate duties and whether there is a legal responsibility that countries have to dealing with their obligations under the Paris Agreement. So really what has been asked of, this is the preamble to what is before the International Court of Justice right now, the ICJ, is 1, what are the obligations of states under international law to ensure the protection of the climate system and other parts of the environment from anthropogenic emissions, and anthropogenic emissions, of course, refer to emissions that are caused by humankind, by the man-made emissions, of greenhouse gases for states and for present and future generations. So that's one of the issues they've been asked to deliberate on. And then also, what are the legal consequences under these obligations for states where they, by their acts and omissions, have caused significant harm to the climate system and other parts of the environment with respect to 1, states, including in particular small island developing states, which due to their geographic circumstances and level of development are injured or specifically affected by or are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change, and 2, people and individuals of the present and future generations who are affected by the adverse impacts of climate change. Now, this is a discussion that the developed world does not want to have, because every time we've had negotiations on loss and damage, they've pushed back and said, no, because we know where you're going with this. You're going in the direction of liability and compensation. You want to say that we are liable and we have to compensate you. This is off the books. There can be no discussion about liability and compensation, that we're not liable for what has happened. I don't know who has released the greenhouse gases, but we're not liable, and we certainly are not, we should not be giving you any compensation. This speaks directly to the heart of this issue. Fortunately, there's a growing form of science that is called attribution science that now allows scientists to determine what level of a disaster has been caused or worsened by climate change. So they can look at a hurricane, they can look at a forest fire, they can look at flooding and determine how much worse that has been made as a result of climate change, which allows us to really determine liability in a much more empirical manner than we've been able to before. So what do we need? We need greater advocacy from civil society, which is why, I enjoy giving these talks, because I think the more we get civil society to understand the issue, the more we can take the discussion outside of the corridors and the theaters of technicians and governments and out into the general public where it belongs, and particularly with you young people, because this is your future that we are imperiling. This is your livelihood that we are making not what it should be. This is your prospects of enjoying the same quality of life that we enjoyed and our grandparents enjoyed that we are diminishing. So it is absolutely important for you to hold the feet of us, those who are in the negotiating space and who frankly caused the problem, hold our feet to the fire and say, we will not tolerate that. But even one step further, we don't want you on the outside looking in and making noise. We want you on the inside as part of the negotiations. We want you on the inside advocating. We've heard a lot about Greta Thunberg and what Greta has done. But I think we need more young people not on the outside talking, but on the inside saying, we will not accept this. We will not accept this lukewarm, this unambitious text that you're putting forward, and we will walk away from it if this is all you're going to give us. I think my generation is a little bit too accepting. And that's why I love your generation, because you're not as tolerant as we are. And I think you have to get involved in this battle and make it your battle. This picture actually was done, this previous picture, this was our picture that we used for COP21. This was done by a St. Lucian artist. In fact, he did a series of three paintings that really symbolize what is happening with climate change. This was the first. We must intensify the pressure on developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and provide timely climate finance to vulnerable countries. So they have to do two things. They have to reduce their emissions, forget all the engineering that they want to do and put thumbs in the ocean. That's not going to work. Do what we know works. Decarbonize your society. Move away from using fossil fuels. The cost of solar and wind and other renewable sources are going down. Let's transition away. We know there's still a lot of money and there's a lot of influence of the big oil companies, but let's start bringing that down. That's important. And very important, we have to understand that the climate crisis, and this is the third of the pictures, third of the paintings, poses an existential threat to small island developing states and other climate vulnerable countries. But the thing is, we're all climate vulnerable countries. The United States of America is a climate vulnerable country, particularly certain cities like New Orleans and New York and Miami that are so prone to sea level rise. Those are climate vulnerable regions. So it's not just small island developing states we talked about. But you must make sustainable development and climate change issues that matter politically, because until we get our politicians to understand that this is as important an issue for you as are all of the other issues that you fight for, because this speaks to your future. This speaks to your viability. This speaks to, we've heard that there's no planet B. There really is no planet B, not even for Elon Musk and Richard Branson. There isn't. They can't, with all of the spaceships that they're building, they can't go live there. None of us can go live anywhere but on this planet. So we have to make sustainable development and climate change issues that matter politically. When you speak to your representatives or the people who want to represent you at all levels, you must find out from them what positions they are taking on climate change and sustainable development and how that will impact your future. We have to drastically change the way all of us operate at all levels. We have to be much more mindful of our consumption and our production, because really what is fueling this climate crisis is greed. It's, and I know it's kind of a difficult thing for me to say, but every time we buy the new iPhone and the new Samsung Galaxy and everything that comes out, we're just fueling this need to continue producing. And honestly, what's the difference between the iPhone 11, 12, 13, and 14? Very little. I mean, I know. Not that I have the iPhone 11, 12, 13, and 14, but I've seen them. There really is and I'm a self-confessed iPhone. I love iPhones. But do we have to buy every single iPhone that comes out? As soon as that it comes out and form long lines outside the Apple store, we're fueling that consumption. But we also, every time we go and we buy food that we don't use and we waste and we throw away, we have to start thinking about what we're doing. and how what we're doing is impacting our planet and is causing this climate crisis to fuel out of proportion. And we also have to increase the education at all levels, not just here, but I'm hoping that I've also now stirred an interest among you that you can now take this as your battle and educate your peers and your families and the people in your community about how important this is. This is actually a book that I produced and edited with Caribbean young people who shared with us how they see the future. You know, it's an anthology of Caribbean youth perspectives on the climate crisis. How do they see their future? What do they see the Caribbean looking like in 2035? If they have a climate skeptic friend, what do they say to that friend? If they were the prime minister of their country addressing the United Nations, what would they say about the climate crisis? And this is part of the work that we do with the Caribbean Climate Justice Project to try to get more young people engaged and involved in this discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been a very good audience. You've listened attentively. Nobody has fallen asleep. Thank you very much. And this is what St. Lucia looks like, by the way. So any of you who have, anytime you want to travel to St. Lucia, this is not on your agenda, I'm sure, for none of you. But St. Lucia is the #1 wedding and honeymoon destination. So when in the future you're thinking about that, make St. Lucia your destination. That's my plug for the St. Lucia Tourism Authority.
Thank you, Jim. And no spring breakers, right?
Oh, yes, spring breakers are welcome, absolutely.
You want spring breakers?
Well, these look like very responsible spring breakers. I won't say that everywhere I go, but you guys look like a responsible set of spring breakers. That won't break anything.
Thank you so very much for this very sobering and very graphically presented picture, which I don't want us to leave on a hopeless note because it really kind of feels like that. And to just connect with some of the things you're saying, I think like the brine in the atmosphere and the particles we don't know anything about in space and stuff. Every time I see an article about the moon, not the moon, Mars, and speculation about what it would mean for humans to survive on the Mars, I'm like, what utter madness is this? Look at this planet. We can't find resources to save it, but we want to go to a planet that has already died. And it is just mind-boggling to me. And I just want to pick up and I'm asking one question and then I'll open it up. The last posters that were in the slides were system change, not climate change. And I know that you're suggesting that this, or implying that the system change has to start at the individual level in terms of our consumption choices. But isn't there a broader problem about how do we change the economic model? Because that's a system. Absolutely. The WTO does not have climate talks, you know. When we talk about growth, I mean...
It's GDP growth.
Yeah.
That's all we measure.
Exactly. We have structured the world in such a way that you end up with billionaires, like the concentration of the wealth in fewer and fewer hands. So Elon Musk can, you know, entertain his dreams of going to Mars, his rockets and everything. And our governments are not much better, at least the governments. So how do we get that system change? And from the perspective of the Caribbean, Ghana, I mean, those companies are sniffing around because there's oil in the Caribbean. And Ghana, which has now the world's largest reserves of oil, which is also below sea level, and has to erect sea walls to keep the water out because most of Ghana is on the coast, is heavily invested in one of the most highly unequal agreements that exists. So how are we complicit? And I'm saying this because Ghana was one of the most highly indebted countries in the world until recently, one of the worst GDPs. So how do you balance that need to use resources in a certain way rather than just leaving the oil in the ground in a context where there is no real incentive for you to do this? So, you know, how do we bring all those different things together to try to address this problem?
let's deal with the Ghana situation first. And that's an excellent example because Ghana, as you said, Ghana was considered one of the poorer countries in the Caribbean, very anemic GDP growth. Now Ghana's GDP growth is rivaling the best in the world. I mean, I think over 20% GDP growth in Ghana. And unfortunately, when we continue to measure a country's success by its gross domestic product, that's the first problem. It's the parameter that we're using to measure success. So yes, you could have high GDP growth, but it's high GDP growth caused by industries that are so extractive that really what they're doing is not sustainable. And at some point, that growth will grind to a halt because you're extracting and extracting from a resource that is not renewable and that you cannot replenish within the period that would allow you to keep that industry viable. So the Ghana situation is unfortunate for a couple of reasons. One, they ignored all of the advice and they went and they negotiated as neophytes with large multinationals and clearly got the bad end of that deal. And in fact, I saw one of the ministers admitting that he was duped when those negotiations took place, which really in this day and age, that should not happen. But secondly, it also shows a lack of creativity, Patsy, because if I were Ghana, I would have said, okay, you know what? We have these large oil reserves. What we need is to ensure that we can, pardon the pun, fuel our development, but not fuel it with fossil fuels. So pay us to keep that oil in the ground. Okay, we don't want to extract that oil, but pay us, give us the support to keep that oil in the ground. We are estimating that oil and gas will cause an increase in our earnings of 15 to 20% per annum. Let's give us that money in the form of direct capital support, and let's see how, because we do not want to extract that oil.
But who's giving the money? The very same companies, where are they located?
Exactly, and that's where your question about system change comes in. And I believe the only way you get the system to change is by the people who are part of the system causing it to change. You know, most of you are too young to remember this, but the tobacco companies refuse to admit that tobacco smoking caused cancer or caused any problems whatsoever. They push back. They hire the most highly paid lobbyists and the best paid lobbyists to push back against this argument. The only time the tobacco companies eventually were brought to heel was when litigation started, and they started losing money from people winning class action suits and other battles in the courts that was forcing them to pay out money. So then they conceded and they agreed, yes, tobacco smoking is dangerous to your health. And all of these labels that you see on the front of cigarette packs, those were fought against. And I think we have to do the same thing with this fossil fuel, which is why I believe as good as the cops are, until we take these countries to court and cause them to start paying for the damage that they're causing, the system will not change because there is no pressure on them to change the system. They know that once a year, and only once a year, we all gather in some part of the world, Kazakhstan or Poland or Emirates or somewhere, for 2 weeks to discuss climate change. So the entire gaze of the world is focused on that country for 2 weeks. And yes, all of the media are there, but then after that, it's business as usual. So all they have to do is ride this storm out, and particularly if they're now going to infiltrate those talks with their lobbyists to make sure that the language that comes out of the text is not too damaging. So we're not talking about a phase out of fossil fuels, which is what we've been clamoring for the longest while. We're talking about a transition, a gradual, we nuancing the language. That's what they're being paid to do. So it's only when civil society says enough is enough. This thing, because the people who control the levers of power will never do anything to imperil their own economic fortunes. I think that's how you change the system, by causing people to understand that these people are playing with your future, that at some point the air will not be safe for you to breathe, as you saw last year because of forest fires that are being fueled by climate change, that you will have to deal with more flooding, more hurricanes, more unconscionably hot temperatures. How do you deal with that? So when we get up and we take them to court, but we also say that we will not elect people who are proponents of this problem, of the cause of this problem, then I think you will see that system changing. Because the people who hold the levers of power will never change it voluntarily. They won't.
I'll open up to questions, comment. You can introduce yourself.
Thank you, Professor Lewis. My name's Alex. I'm currently a senior at Brown. And one question I just had was that, like one theme I saw throughout your presentation was that, like, political change is, like, a really big mechanism to, like, create, like, hold these people accountable and create, like, climate justice. But my question is, how do we actually cause this political change to happen when most of the politicians on the ballot don't care either way? And it's like, especially since, like, one individual vote isn't going to change things, like, how do we collectively as a group actually cause this political change in countries like the US?
Right. Excellent question. I think two ways. One, you're never too young to start a political career. And I think you have to look at that as a possibility, because change is much easier to change from within than to change from without. But I think also coming together as a group. Margaret Mead said that never doubt that a small group of committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. And I firmly believe that a small group can mushroom into a larger and larger group. So the only thing politicians listen to is the numbers of people who put pressure on them. If you only do it, if you're the one pest that keeps writing them letters, yeah, they'll easily shunt you off. But if your entire class does it, and your class now gets other classes to do it, they, first of all, that nuisance becomes a bigger nuisance, but they also know that you have influence. And the last thing they want is for your group to now evolve into a larger and larger lobbying group that they have to deal with. So I believe the way you deal with it is twofold. First of all, by educating and getting more people involved, but also don't let the politicians be 90-year-old people who are making decisions on your behalf. I'm nothing against a 90-year-old, but I mean, you need people like you getting into politics, because for the 90-year-old, they don't really care about climate change. By the time these things are really exploding in their faces, they will be past. Now, I say to people, especially in the Caribbean, that climate change is an equal opportunity destroyer, because it's not so much a case here. But in the Caribbean, all of our cemeteries are located near the shore, because that's where we have sand. So it's a lot easier to dig the sand. So all of our cemeteries are near the coast. So I've said to those people, the older people in the Caribbean, don't think that because you will not be around by the turn of this century that you won't be impacted, because your bones, instead of resting in peace, will be swimming in peace or sinking in peace, because climate change and sea level rise will take your gravesites away. So it's an equal opportunity destroyer. But sorry for the digression. It's two ways. Get involved and get more people involved.
Thank you, Dr. Fletcher, for your lecture. My name is Arissa, and I'm a junior here at Brown. So I know you mentioned within your lecture that one of our priorities should be getting, like, developing countries into court and, like, putting them on trial.
Developed countries.
Yeah, developed countries. I'm curious to know, has there ever been a moment where they have been on trial, or if not developed countries, specific, like, corporations, like the oil companies that you were mentioning, for example? Like, is it feasible for this to happen, or is there any conflicts? Because you also mentioned that some of them do lie and go through, like, other obligations just to get out of, like, giving money to developing countries.
Well, I think this case, yes, sure. Sure.
Thanks for this presentation, Dr. Fletcher. I'm Justin. I am a freshman at Brown, and I was wondering, kind of along those same lines as well, when it comes to litigation and prosecution, how do you foresee or envision meaningful change being created from that, and not just more bureaucracy?
Yeah, good questions, excellent questions, both of them. This case that we have, this test case in front of the International Court of Justice, I think will be the litmus test about what we can do, because we haven't yet had this tested at the highest levels. And I think a lot will depend on what the International Court of Justice says. There's still a lot of body of evidence that's being collected. In fact, I was asked to contribute to an opinion on it for the submission from the Caribbean. We have to make sure that we build a strong case. But I think the UN recognizing that that the right to a healthy environment is a human right, I think that lays the basis, because if every individual has the right to a healthy, sustainable environment, and you have countries and companies that are making that impossible or imperiling that right, then clearly that is something that has to be looked at. There was actually a very interesting test case that came out of Antigua, went all the way to the Privy Council just 2 days ago, where two individuals took the government to court over an issue with some development that was happening in the Antigua and Barbuda. So there are two islands that form Antigua and Barbuda. And there was a development that was taking place. And basically, the development had already taken place. But the two individuals argued that this development was wrong, that they argued on environmental grounds, on social grounds. And the government's case was, okay, but we've already done it. It's already happened. So this is a moot point. What are you arguing about something? So you're arguing about a runway that should not be built, but the runway has been built. So what's the redress? Do we break down the runway? And the Privy Council said, yeah, they have a point, and it's not because it has already been done that something cannot be done about it. And if the redress is destroying or undoing what has been done, then that should not be an obstacle to doing what is right. So I think increasingly there's a body of jurisprudence that is being built around these issues, and what we have to do is just continue to fight this, because the more cases that have to be looked at in different jurisdictions, the greater the body of case law that will develop on it, and that will give us something. But because it's still a new issue, and like I said, what helps is attribution science. So you can now say that this problem that we have has been worsened by 25 or 30% by climate change. Before they can say, okay, but you're saying that there was flooding and the flooding wiped out this country, this community, but there's always been flooding. So how can you attribute it to climate change? I think that was the impediment. Now we can have direct empirical data that indicates the impact of climate change. So that really gives us the evidence on which we can stand in a court and say, no, this was caused by climate change. So what you have to do is to battle with me on a scientific basis, not on an anecdotal or an opinion level. And I think that's important. But we have to build up that case law. We have to build up that jurisprudence on this issue.
Hi, Dr. Fletcher. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Deja, and I'm a senior here. And I'm really interested in what you said about climate refugees, because I haven't heard anybody talk about that. I'm from the U.S. Virgin Islands, and my family had to leave after Hurricanes Maria and Irma in 2017. So we relocated, my immediate family, but a lot of people chose to stay and rebuild. And as far as I know, most people do that with their own resources. They're sort of like pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Yeah. But I'm wondering what sort of infrastructure is there to help people either relocate or rebuild after these natural disasters.
Thank you. That's a living example of what we talk about when we speak of loss and damage. There's a community in Dominica called Petit Savan that after Tropical Storm Erica hit, the entire community was evacuated, and the government gave very strict instructions that there should be no rebuilding. People should not move back into that area. The government used its own resources. And that's why when I say that Caribbean countries are in this continuous cycle of repair and recovery, a lot is made of the debt that's being carried by many Caribbean countries, and they refer to as, they have high debt to GDP. Nobody really examines the cause of that debt. A lot of that debt is recovering from disasters like your country has had to, and so many other countries in the Caribbean have had to. Now, if the climate finance mechanism was working properly, what you would get is this would trigger money coming out from the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Loss and Damage Fund, that would go directly to this issue, because that is a direct impact of climate change. I mean, Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria happened in a period where the Caribbean, that was 2017, where you had an unprecedented number of Cat 5 storms hitting the Caribbean. So that is something where the climate finance architecture is supposed to be able to allow us to deal with that. Unfortunately, it does not. So what you have is governments digging deeper and deeper into their pockets and using their own meager resources that really should be going to providing universal health care and proper education and proper social infrastructure and roads and everything else. That now has to go to recovering from the next hurricane and the next flooding and the next heavy winds that went through. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Claire Jones. I work at the Brown Library. I was really interested when you talked about alliances between Caribbean nations and Pacific nations, when you talked about Kiribati and the Marshall Islands. So I was wondering, what does it look like to be negotiating and making these cross-international, global connections between different small islands across the whole world?
The Small Island Alliance works very well. We negotiate on an umbrella called AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States. We've existed for quite some time, and that's really all of the small island states in the Caribbean, in the Pacific Ocean, the Indian Ocean, countries like the Seychelles. So all of us come together, and we negotiate under that alliance. That alliance holds really well, and we have common issues. So there really are no big problems there. There's a commonality of purpose, there's a commonality of challenges, and there's a commonality of thinking on what the response should be. Where the challenge lies is in the bigger umbrella under which we negotiate, which is G77 plus China. So within the UN negotiating theater, there is G77 plus China. Now, G77 started off as a group of non-aligned countries. It's now grown much larger than that. G77 includes China, it includes India, it also includes Saudi Arabia, it includes many of the countries that are part of the problem. So very often, now, if you can get consensus within G77 plus China, then you're 2/3 of the way in winning your battle, because that is the major grouping of developing, and some of them are developed countries. But this is being live streamed, so I have to be careful about what I say. But sometimes getting consensus among G77 plus China is one of the most difficult things. I will not say what I was going to say, but it's one of the most difficult things to get because you have such diverging agendas there. During COP21, when I was co-chairing the committee that was charged with landing the text on the long-term ambition and the 1.5 degree Celsius target, some of the strongest opposition I got was within G77 plus China, from some of the countries in there that felt that a 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold would be inimical to their interests, to their economic interests and their political interests. So, you know, AOSIS is solid, AOSIS is united, AOSIS, I've never really seen any chinks in the armor of AOSIS. Where you have a problem is in a wider G77 plus China grouping, because you have divergent agendas in there. You have oil producers in there, and you have small island developing states that are victims of the actions of these oil producers. So that's where the challenge often arises. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Hello, my name is Sophia. I'm a freshman. And I was wondering, when we talk about the effects of climate change on small island developing states, we can really tie a lot of the systemic issues in these countries back to colonialism, right? And I was wondering if at all, and if so, how you, in the initiatives that you've been a part of, have incorporated indigenous philosophies and politics and ways of life into the way that we're looking at these solutions.
Absolutely brilliant. Will you take the other one? Yeah.
I was wondering if you work with climate advocates in like Middle East and Northern Africa, because I know the Caribbean and the MENA region are some of the most vulnerable. So I was wondering if there's like solidarity among the advocates and you guys work together.
There is. In fact, I'll come to your question and I'll come back to the other one about the traditional and indigenous approaches. So I'll give the story. When we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, there were 3 informal ministerials. I'd said I was going to keep this for my book, but I'll still give it out there. There were 3 informal ministerials that were held. And in the pre-COP, I was approached by the Minister of the Environment from Australia, Greg Hunt, who said to me that St. Lucia had been blocking Australia on an issue of land use and how they accounted for emissions from land use changes, and that they wanted St. Lucia to withdraw its opposition, in return for which they would agree to support us on getting an ambitious agreement. So I went back to my technical people, because we spoke minister to minister. I went back to my technical people. I said, the environment minister from Australia said that St. Lucia is blocking Australia on something. Are we the only ones blocking? They said, no, South Africa is also blocking them on this. So I went across to the chief negotiator from South Africa, and I said to him, his name was Alf. I said to him, Alf, I've just been approached by the minister from Australia who wants us to back off. I am all for saying to him that we're willing to give him some space to ensure that his accounting falls in line with the traditional, with the recognized accounting methods for land use, providing that he supports us on 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal. And Alf said to me, yes, Africa is with you on this, because 1.5 is as important to Africa as it is to small island developing states. So yes, let's do this. So we did it, but we kept the fact that we were talking to each other hidden from the Australians. So they tried to play one against the other and say, well, you know, South Africa has already agreed, and St. Lucia has already agreed, but we knew we hadn't. So when we showed up for the meeting, Australia was kind of caught on the back foot and said, okay, you know, yeah, if you guys agree to give us the space, we will support you on 1.5 degrees Celsius. The very next day, at the very first plenary, Australia stays absolutely silent on 1.5 degrees Celsius, nothing. So I get these frantic calls from my negotiators telling me, Minister, there's nothing happening. Australia's not saying. I say, okay, give them some time. It's still early days. Next day, they say absolutely nothing. So I call Alf. I said, well, you know, these guys seem to be reneging on this agreement. I am minded to put this out in the open. He said, yeah, Minister, go ahead. So I called the Sydney Morning Herald, gave an interview to the Sydney Morning Herald, told the Sydney Morning Herald that Australia had agreed to back the Caribbean and African countries on 1.5 degrees Celsius. Sydney Morning Herald ran this as a front page story. The minister from Australia was caught on the back foot and then had to say that, yes, you know, we've agreed. And that's how Australia came on board with 1.5. And that's through cooperation between the Caribbean and AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, and African countries. So there is quite a bit of sharing of information. The African countries are also part of G77 plus China. So we work very much in solidarity. Not all the time, not on everything, but on the vast majority of issues, there's a oneness of approach there. But that's what you do in the climate change negotiations. And even sometimes you have to find, because one of the strongest allies we had in Paris was Canada, because Canada had just come on board with Trudeau, and Catherine McKenna was the new minister, and they wanted to show that they were progressive. So Canada was one of our biggest allies for an ambitious agreement. The European Union was also a big ally. So you get sometimes support in areas. New Zealand has also been very progressive on these issues, unlike Australia. So you get allies even within the developed countries sometimes. Yeah. Now, going back to the question about indigenous approaches, absolutely correct. A lot of this can be traced back to the legacy that has been left behind. And you know, the underdevelopment of many Caribbean islands is as a result of that legacy. And there's some very interesting books that have been written, including by Professor Hilary Beckles, about how the Caribbean has been underdeveloped. Unfortunately, we have not sufficiently used indigenous and traditional approaches to dealing with those problems. We had some flooding in St. Lucia in November of the year before. And the flooding was in the north of the island. The rest of the island was fine. But the flooding was pronounced in two communities. One community called Rivière Mita, and another community called Grand Rivière. Now, St. Lucia, because it was 7 times French, 7 times English, has a lot of French place names. So it dawned on me that Rivière Mita in Creole, in French, means the middle of the river. Grand Rivière means a large river. What had happened was that we had built communities in areas that were floodplains before. And if you build a community in a floodplain, when you get heavy rains, the water will go back to that path of least resistance, which is that floodplain. So very often in our adaptation to climate change, we have to take account of indigenous and traditional knowledge. And as a scientist, I say to people, it is very arrogant of us scientists to believe that the only science that can be trusted is the science that has been peer-reviewed in a journal. Because what our foreparents have observed is as a result of generations of observation that note a correlation between one thing and another. It may not have been put down in Nature or in Science or in some prestigious journal, but that is as a result of things that they've observed over generations. And we should not discount it just for the modern science that we believe is the only source of truth on this. So the indigenous and traditional knowledge is important. It is something that I think slowly is being accepted, but it has an absolute, because when we talk about nature-based solutions, for example, which is a big part of the response to climate change, nature-based solutions are really talking about indigenous and traditional solutions that we've known work. Yeah? Go on.
Hello. Hi, Dr. Fletcher. I'm a sophomore at Brown. You touched on this a little bit about economic models, but I was very curious to know how we can start to hold these larger corporations accountable for their the effect on climate change, and also how we as the next generation can produce more sustainable economic models that will help mitigate the effects of climate change.
We have to look at changing our economic model from being a linear one, which is one where we extract, use, and dispose, to a circular one, where we try to reuse, recycle, repurpose as much as possible. I think that's the first step. We can do it at the individual level, but we have to ensure that that is something that all of our countries move towards, a more circular economic model, because it's gaining traction, definitely. But I think the mistake many people make, particularly those who control the levers of economic power in our countries, is believing that the sustainable model is a more expensive model. That making that transition from a brown economy, which is one where it's extractive and it's oil and everything, to a green, blue economy is costly. It's not. In the long run, it's cheaper. In the long run, it saves jobs. In the long run, it improves the lives and health of people. And in the long run, it's just better for the planet. Clearly what we have now is not working. When you look at, there's a concept called Earth Overshoot Day, which is where every year they determine the exact day in the year when we would have used up all of the resources that the planet is capable of generating on a yearly basis. And Earth Overshoot Day is moving further and further away from the 31st of December because we are extracting more and more resources from our planet than we can. So really, if Earth Overshoot Day were to work properly, it should be on the 31st of December. It's like you have your budget, and you want to make sure that whatever you've budgeted to use for the year, that you absolutely spend the last bit of that money on the 31st of December. If you're really good, then hopefully you can even carry it over into the next year. But let's assume you've budgeted really well. But if you're spending your entire budget, your entire allowance by the 25th of August or by the 17th of July, then something is wrong. And that's what's happening now, because we are using up all of the resources that our planet is capable of producing in July or August of the year. So clearly, we have to look at this thing differently, and we have to push back against the argument that sustainable development is more costly, that sustainable development is more difficult. It is not. Sustainable development is less costly in the long run. It generates a whole set of new jobs. Yes, there's some level of retraining that must take place, but the thing is, you don't have to retrain you guys. Because, you're the ones who will form the who are already forming the workforce, but will definitely form the workforce in 2, 3, 4 years' time. We just have to make sure that you enter the workforce with a totally different perspective to the one that I did and my parents did. And that is one that understands that we have to live in harmony with our planet. That the planet is not something that is there for us to use as we want, because we're humans. We are the most intelligent species, and we can do what we want. We can't. And you saw during COVID what happened when you took humans away from the ecosystem, how everything just came back to life. And that's the kind of dampening effect we're having on this planet right now. Now, I'm not advocating take humans away, but what I'm advocating is at least let's try to live in greater harmony with our environment. We're not doing that right now.
It seems like an intelligent solution to me to take the humans away. It also seems appropriate somehow to speak about Earth Overshoot Day on the 29th of February, which is a day that we arbitrarily added to the calendar in order to make us correspond. So perhaps there's a way of adjusting the calendar or adjusting our the way in which we use resources that can actually get us more in harmony with the cycles of nature and the cycles of indigenous philosophies and the cycles of what we can do that is bringing us toward a more solution to the grave problems. I was really incredibly impressed by the presentation, by the underlying thought and science behind it, and also I think, like all of us, sobered by the task, the gargantuan nature of the task that we have in front of us. But what you've shown us is that the perspective from small island developing states is extremely valuable, perhaps even more valuable than the one that we normally hear regularly. So please join me in thanking Dr. Fletcher for a fantastic presentation. You're always welcome back here.
Yeah, in the spring.
Thank you so much.
My
That was
pleasure.
really,
My pleasure.
really just